Hello, it is 1DM here to talk about proficiency tracks in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. What exactly do I mean by proficiency tracks? Well, there are many aspects of a Pathfinder character's progression that are determined solely by their class, which grants them proficiency increases at specific levels. I got to wondering to what extent these progression tracks were standardized across classes. Was there a simple method the designers used to decide these? In this video, I'm going to take a look at every class-determined proficiency for every class in the game, discussing both standardization and its effects on your character. But before I do that, let's first make sure we understand some basics. As a reminder, there are basically 5 levels of proficiency in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. An untrained character adds no proficiency bonus to the relevant skill. A trained character adds their level +2 to the skill, Expert adds level +4, Master adds level +6, and Legendary adds level +8. Throughout this video, I'll be using these colors on screen to refer to the proficiency levels, so keep them in mind. Let's start with something pretty simple. Class or spell DC. Every class grants proficiency with either a spell DC used for your spellcasting or a class DC used for any special actions granted by your class. A few martial classes have both, using the spell DC for focus spells, but the proficiencies increase in tandem. So here is the chart of all class and spell DC progression tracks. Each row represents a single class's progression from level 1 to 20. Each cell shows what level of proficiency that class has at that level. You may notice that there are 2 lines for clerics. Cloistered clerics use the track for full casters, while war priest clerics use the slower track for martial classes, never reaching legendary with their spells. Overall, however, what we can see is that class and spell DC proficiency is pretty well standardized. All full casters have exactly the same progression, gaining Expert at level 7, Master at 15, and Legendary at 19. This makes a lot of sense, as spell attacks and DCs affect a large majority of actions taken by spellcasters, and it's definitely good design for them to all be on the same numerical power level. The martial classes basically take this progression and shift it later by 2 or 4 levels. Martial classes are a little bit less uniform since they don't rely as heavily on their class DC for their power. It's still worth noting that there's never a huge gap between any classes. The lowest class DC is never more than 1 proficiency step behind the highest spell DC. I also find it interesting that there are only 2 classes that do more than shift the caster progression. The Investigator and Swashbuckler also stay at Expert for 2 levels longer than all the other classes. These are also the only martial classes introduced in the Advanced Player's Guide. I have to wonder if this choice was intentional for the advanced classes or just a coincidence. Speaking of well standardized though, the next thing I'll look at is weapon specialization. This is the one thing I'll talk about in this video that isn't technically a proficiency, however it is a very standard feature that progresses based on your class. All characters start out with no weapon specialization. When they gain regular weapon specialization, they deal an extra 2 damage with all weapons they're expert in, 3 for master or 4 for legendary. When a character gains greater weapon specialization, this doubles to 4, 6, or 8 extra damage. On this chart, the dark cells mean no specialization, gray is regular, and blue is greater weapon specialization. We can see here very clearly that this feature is completely standardized. Martial classes gain tier 1 at level 7 and tier 2 at level 15, while casters gain tier 1 at level 13. I do find it interesting that full casting classes still gain this feature at all. This suggests to me that casters' weapon damage is meant to be at least non-zero, even at high levels. But to take a closer look at that, let's look at weapon proficiencies. Of course, not all weapon proficiencies are created equal. You'll notice next to each class, I note what type of weapons they are proficient with. S for simple, M for martial, U for unarmed, and A for advanced. The plus sign indicates that the class gains 1 or more extra weapons, such as the cleric's deity's favorite weapon, or the wizard's short list of simple weapons. Aside from the weapon types though, we can see that weapon proficiency is also relatively standardized. There's the standard martial track of Expert at level 5 and Master at 13, and there's the standard caster track of Expert at 11. Alchemists and War Priest clerics get Expert 4 levels earlier than most non-martials, presumably since those classes are intended to use weapons or bombs more than others. And then there's the Fighter. The Fighter is a whole proficiency step better than every other martial class at every level. This is just absurd. I can't emphasize enough how crazy that is. There is not a single other feature in the game for which any class is that much better than everyone else. It's just wild. Fighters are a lot. Other than fighters, though, the other classes aren't actually that far apart. Much like weapon specialization, casters are never more than one step behind martial classes. If you watched my previous video, you know that consistently being at a -2 compared to other classes is still a big downside for your damage output, but my takeaway here is that wielding a weapon as a caster is not completely useless. If you can even get a consistent bonus to your attacks, such as by playing a bard who consistently casts Inspire Courage, it's not totally unreasonable to play a caster who uses weapons on occasion. It's probably not the strongest numerically, but it sounds fun. Going from weapon proficiencies, let's now look at armor. Again, I've noted next to each class which armor types they can use. U for unarmored, L for light, M for medium, or all. At the top, we of course see monks and champions dominating here as the most tanky classes by far. Notably, champions don't increase to expert for 6 levels after monks, but I think this difference is deceptive. Level 1 monks will wear no armor and receive a +4 bonus to their AC from their dexterity, where level 1 champions will probably have +5 from their armor and dexterity combined and +6 soon after. This basically negates the proficiency difference at early levels. In other words, champions and monks will end up with basically the same armor abilities. Past those two classes, the rest is pretty standard. The other martials gain expert at level 13 and master at 19, the fighter being shifted 2 levels earlier. Casters are the same with no increase to master. The gaps in proficiency levels aren't that large as well. At almost all levels, casters will be only one step behind the highest classes, and if you exclude the top 3, every other class has exactly the same armor proficiency for the first 18 levels. But there are other factors contributing to the differences between classes here. Sure, your sorcerer may have the same armor proficiency as a ranger at most levels, but they don't have any actual armor they can wear, meaning they need to invest heavily in dexterity to get anywhere near what the ranger will have. And unlike a ranger, they won't benefit from that dexterity as often, so it's a big cost. In other words, the conclusion here is that monks and champions are intended to have the highest AC in the game, and the rest of the class's differences in armor will mostly be made up by what armor type they wear and how much they can invest in dexterity. Now let's look at the one proficiency that isn't strictly combat related, perception. While it will affect most initiative rolls, perception doesn't get used all that much in combat and is more relevant for searching, investigating, and reading people. This is one proficiency that varies a lot for each class and allows large gaps between the better and worse classes. Unsurprisingly, the Ranger, Rogue, and Investigator are the clear winners of this skill based on their thematic ability to track, find traps, and, well, investigate. The Fighter and Swashbuckler are next, which I think is primarily meant to reflect their ability to react quickly in a fight. The Bard is a jack of all trades. After this, it's harder to analyze the proficiencies based purely on the thematic intent of what the class is supposed to be good at. I'm especially confused by the monk here. I think of the stereotypical monk as wise, in tune with their surroundings, and experts at reading people, but their perception is quite lacking compared to most classes. At the bottom, finally, we see many of the dedicated casters, which is an unfortunately common theme with all these charts so far. But that will partially change with the last few proficiencies I look at. It's time to talk about saving throws. Before I take a look at the charts though, it's important to understand how saving throws are different from other skills. Every time a feature grants an increase to master in a saving throw, it also causes all successes in that save to become critical successes. This feature is called Juggernaut for Fortitude saves, Evasion for Reflex saves, and Resolve for Will saves. This pretty significantly reduces the amount of damage you'll take from effects of that save type, as you can no longer take half damage from a success. Now you'll either take double damage, full damage, or no damage. Then when a feature grants an increase to Legendary with a save, this ability gets turned up to 11. Greater Juggernaut, Greater Evasion, and Greater Resolve mean that if you roll a critical failure in the relevant save, it gets upgraded to a regular failure. If you roll a regular failure, you take half as much damage. The power of this effect cannot be overstated. Now, instead of the possibilities of double, full, half, or no damage against a damaging effect, you've upgraded every result, so the outcomes are full, half, or no damage. You'll still take other effects from a failure, such as conditions, but overall you will take incredibly little damage from saving throws you're legendary in. I promise this video isn't math heavy, but in order to make sure you understand how huge this is, I ran the numbers on one example. With 3 example characters with the same reflex save, adjusted by +2 and +4 for extra proficiency steps, here's how they perform against the damaging effect. The expert character took an average of about 45 damage. This is our baseline, so we'll call it 100% and compare everything back to it. The Master, not accounting for successes transforming to critical successes, takes 90% as much damage. The Legend, not accounting for crit fails becoming fails and fails taking half damage, takes 74% as much damage. These results are purely resulting from having a higher save. If we do account for the extra effects of Master Proficiency, the Master instead takes 58% of baseline, or 64% as much as it took without those effects. If we then take into account the extra effects of Legendary Proficiency, the Legend instead takes 21% of baseline, or 28% as much as it did without these effects. Let that sink in. In this example, the extra effects of Legendary Proficiency cause a character to take less than a third as much damage as another character with the same save modifier. Okay, that's my math rant for the day. Back to the proficiency tracks. Let's start by looking at Fortitude saves. Like Perception, we're going to see that all saving throws vary a lot by individual class. Fortitude saves are a very interesting case because Barbarians are the only class that reaches Legendary in them. Predictably, the other upfront and tanky classes are also up there, including the Champion, Fighter, Ranger, and War Priest. I'm not entirely sure why the Alchemist is so high. The less defensive martials can be found lower down, such as the Investigator, Rogue, and Swashbuckler. Again, we find all of our full casters on the low end, none of them even reaching Master. You may notice that monks aren't on this chart. That's going to be the case for all three saves. This is because, unlike every other class, monks don't have predetermined saves. Each monk gets to choose which saves to advance to Master and Legendary. Thus, there isn't really a good way to compare them for individual saves. However, I'll still discuss how they compare overall at the end. Next, let's move on to Reflex saves. There are surprisingly few classes and levels with Master Proficiency compared to Fortitude saves. There are 3 classes that get Legendary though, being the Rogue, Swashbuckler, and Ranger, compared to just the Barbarian for Fortitude. These all make a lot of sense thematically. Then we see the Alchemist, Fighter, and Investigator as the other classes who reach Master, and once again all of our caster friends never reach Master. However, it is notable that the Barbarian and Champion are the 2 martial classes who don't reach Master, which also makes thematic sense. Lastly, we'll look at will saves, and this chart is fascinating to me. An extremely small area is occupied by classes that trained. Almost everyone starts expert in will saves. The 3 classes who start trained are also the only 3 who never reach Master. The 3 classes who reach Legendary do so late, but are 2 full casters and the Investigator. Up until now, every single proficiency track has fallen into a nice order. If one class ever receives Master before another class, it will also receive Legendary before that class as well, or at the same time. The Investigator breaks this pattern. He reaches Master in will saves after the Cleric, but reaches Legendary where the Cleric doesn't. Once again, I note that the pattern breaker is from the Advanced Player's Guide, and I have to wonder if this was intentional. Now that I've looked at each individual save, let's look at all of them together. For this chart, the value in each cell is the sum of a class's save proficiencies. Trained adds 1, Expert 2, Master 3, and Legendary 4. This system isn't perfect, as Master and Legendary increases are more impactful than Expert for saving throws, but I tried to keep it simple. We can see that this chart is much less neatly ordered than the others. I had expected to see monks at the top, as they're clearly pretty tanky characters, but I was a bit more surprised to see Rangers here. I guess it helps that they're 3rd best at Reflex and 5th best at Fortitude. I wasn't initially expecting all the full casting classes to be worse across the board than martials at saving throws, though it wasn't surprising after seeing the individual saves. I'm also a bit surprised to see champions at the bottom of the martials. For a class that's themed around tanking and support, they're surprisingly mediocre at saves. So what's my conclusion from all this? Well, there's a lot of fine detail, and I could analyze and compare charts for hours, but I don't think I'd get much more meaning out of it, and I'd go a little crazy in the process. But my biggest takeaway is simply that casters kinda got the short end of the stick on almost every proficiency. Paizo tried really hard to solve the problem other systems have, of casters' versatility and options making them insanely strong at higher levels. The more I learn about this game, the more I see different ways they did this, and sometimes it feels like a bit too many ways. To be clear, I'm not saying I know more than Pathfinder's designers. Just that casters sometimes feel a bit lackluster and hard to use. But I'm sure a lot of people disagree, and I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to tell me I should keep making more like it. If you didn't, please leave a comment letting me know what I can do better or what you would like to see instead. This is 1DM out. Have a great day.